One of the most important sea changes in the Roman Empire of the 4th century was the promotion of Christianity by Constantine and subsequent emperors. And this was at the same time accompanied by the increasing focus on first discouraging and then actively suppressing paganism. And these actions culminated later in Christianity being made the official religion of the empire by the Emperor Theodosius in 380 CE, and the subsequent outright banning of traditional Roman beliefs and pagan customs shortly after that. Now, this is a fairly short period. Constantine became emperor in 306 CE, so we're talking about a span of only 74 short years. It's estimated and generally accepted by the bulk of scholars that only around 10% of the Roman Empire's population was Christian during the time of Constantine. Now, this was a slow and steady growth, given that it had taken 300 years to reach that figure, even though Christianity was an aggressively evangelical cult. But it could hardly be called an explosive expansion. Most people simply had no interest in deserting their own traditional Roman beliefs, traditions and culture for a more dour religion based on Jewish belief and mythology, and with a foreign Jewish carpenter as a messiah without which you could not get into an idyllic Christian heaven. But with Roman emperors constantly favouring and promoting Christianity from Constantine onwards, and with the increasing pressure to convert through official legislation in earlier years, and then later much more open persecution, by the end of the Western Roman Empire, paganism had effectively been destroyed and Christianity gained a lasting stranglehold over the empire. From Constantine's time, a series of imperial edicts and laws were passed, both favouring Christianity and suppressing paganism. And in fact, the Christian emperors took various measures against the Jews as well. So in this video, the first in a series, we'll chronicle the promotion of Christianity and also the anti-pagan and anti-Jewish edicts declared during the Constantinian Dynasty. This period began in 306 CE, with Constantine being raised to emperor by his troops, and ended in 363 with the death of the Emperor Julian, who famously apostatized from Christianity. Julian was followed by the strongly Christian Jovian, who only lasted less than a year, however. So, as you can see, for much of this period, the Roman Empire was under the control of Constantine and then his son Constantius, although his other sons Constans and Constantine II, being co-emperors for some time, also played their parts for a while. And in part 2 of this video, we'll go through the period after Jovian, from the Valentinian dynasty up to the Theodosian period and beyond, where the pressure against pagan customs and beliefs was turned up to a much higher degree, with the destruction of temples in full swing and open persecution of non-believers. And as we go through this period, the trend is unmistakable. The laws that Constantine passed in earlier years tended to favour Christianity without any overt aggression against pagans. However, once he was sole ruler of the empire after defeating Licinius, who was emperor in the east till 324 CE, the laws addressing pagan worship became gradually more unfriendly. After his death, his sons continued his religious policies, and Constantius, who outlasted his brothers, came out with decrees that were yet more aggressive as his confidence grew, and as the ruling elite became increasingly Christian, as Constantine and his son promoted more and more Christians as governors and people in power. Okay, a quick word before we dive in on the sources that we have on this subject. Our primary sources are the Codex Theodosianus, as well as various writers like Eusebius, who wrote Life of Constantine, and Lactantius. And we're also fortunate to have the writings of Rufinus and Socrates Scholasticus, Sozomen and Theodoret, amongst others. And I'll leave links to the books in the description below if you'd like to look into these sources. And if you'd like to read up on this subject and the laws themselves in terms of more modern books, then the book by Norton Coleman, The Roman State and Christian Church, coming in 3 volumes, is probably the best work on the subject, along with the Theodosian Code by Clyde Farr. And perhaps the best general book, and one I would recommend on the persecution of pagans and the destruction of pagan religious places, is the one by Catherine Nixey called The Darkening Age, and published in 2017. A few caveats before we start. This is not by any means an exhaustive list of all the legislation related to religion passed by the various emperors. I'm mainly bringing forward the edicts and rulings which actively favour and promote Christianity, and those which were passed to counter paganism and or Judaism. So I'm not including the numerous decrees passed which were solely to do with the running and internal organisation of the Christian Church. And I'm also not including the considerable number of rulings and edicts passed by Constantine and the other emperors against the numerous other Christian sects and cults which had sprouted up over the previous 300 years and which were deemed to be heretics or schismatics and were therefore met with disapproval and also persecution and official condemnation. And that would be the subject of another video. Anyway, let's dive into it. On the 1st of May 305 CE, the Emperor Diocletian resigned and retired to his country estate, leaving the empire divided under what was called the Tetrarchy. And this was a system of two senior emperors, or Augusti, ruling the western and eastern portions of the empire, and two junior rulers, or Caesars, working under them. And this led to a period of relative confusion and a fractured empire for around 20 years, with various emperors and Caesars and usurpers fighting for control, a period which only ended in 324. Constantine's father, Constantius II, who'd been promoted by Diocletian, had been raised to the status of emperor in Britain by his troops, but became severely sick over the course of his reign and would die shortly after that. And Constantius's troops quickly transferred their loyalty to his son and raised Constantine to the status of emperor on the 25th of July 306 in Eboracum, i.e. York, in the province of Britannia. Now, we can quite conveniently divide Constantine's rule into two sections. The first phase, lasting 18 years, begins from him being declared emperor in 306 CE. And during this phase, he passed many edicts and laws helping to promote Christianity, but not so much targeted against paganism or suppressing paganism in any way, since many of the governors and officials of the empire were still pagan at this time. The second phase of his life, lasting 13 years, begins when he defeated Licinius, the Eastern Roman Emperor, at the Battle of Chrysopolis in 324 CE and became the sole ruler of the entire empire. After this battle, his more interesting edicts actively begin to target paganism and begin to involve the destruction of important temples as Christian governors and other officials are promoted to power over pagans. So let's go through his gradual promotion of Christianity first, and then we'll go through the edicts against pagans and Jews. So, even at this early stage of his life, when he'd just gained power, there are early signs of Christian influence, or at least a neutral stance over religion from Constantine. The first evidence of this is an accord between Constantine and Galerius, who was at the time the Augustus in the East, to end the persecution of Christians in the entire Roman Empire. And this agreement was called the Edict of Sardica. But Constantine had no control over the East at all, and he barely controlled the West, with another competitor, Maxentius, controlling Italy. So how influential this edict was is difficult to say, as Galerius was a pagan and hated Christianity. The edict records Christians moving away from or abandoning the Roman customs and traditions, and that they did not obey any longer the institutes of antiquity which their own ancestors had first established. But Constantine declared that, quote, "we ought to grant our most prompt indulgence also to these, so that they may again be Christians and may hold their conventicles, provided they do nothing contrary to good order," unquote. So Sardica allowed Christians to cast off their Roman customs and traditions and adopt Judeo-Christian leanings. The Edict of Sardica, as can be seen, was couched in terms which suggested Constantine was still pagan, and this was probably deliberate as he consolidated his power over the section of the empire that he controlled. And in any case, he probably didn't want to ruin relations with Galerius or Maxentius at this stage anyway. However, relations with Maxentius did deteriorate. And shortly after this accord, on the 28th of October 312, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge took place, in which Constantine defeated Maxentius, gaining himself control over the entire western section of the Roman Empire. And this meant that Constantine could now be much more open in his conversion. And the agreement he came up with the Emperor Licinius, who by now controlled the entire eastern part of the Roman Empire, was what was now called the Edict of Milan. This edict was agreed to and declared on the 13th of February 313 CE, and this guaranteed freedom of religion all across the Roman Empire. In other words, freeing Christians from any restrictions and persecution. And all their property was to be restored, including churches and any other buildings. And as history shows, this was a far more influential imperial ruling than the Edict of Sardica. And so both these edicts taken together effectively signalled the effective conversion of Constantine and his publicly favouring Christianity. And Constantine would pretty much immediately begin his pro-Christian policies. He carried out or made 4 important decisions or policies regarding the church during his life, some of which would perhaps plague the empire and in fact Christian European culture for the next 2,000 years and have a serious and lasting impact to this very day. The first was the promotion of the church and Christian clergy into a parallel and independent institution outside of secular powers and answerable only to itself. Secondly, inheritance laws allowing people to leave their property and wealth to the church. Third, the cultural changes, specifically promotion of celibacy. And fourthly, promotion of Sunday to a holy day. So let's discuss the promotion of the church first. Shortly after the Edict of Milan, Constantine ordered imperial subsidies to be provided to Catholic priests in North Africa in 313 CE. And this was a location where there was a lot of inter-Christian differences and violence, with Catholics up against other sects like the Donatists, for example. The Donatists were labelled as heretics, and even pagans who were attempting to convert Catholics needed to be corrected as far as Constantine was concerned. And in addition, Catholic clergy and priests were freed from having to do compulsory public service in North Africa as well. In fact, the beginning of Christian clergy being exempt from most things. And shortly after that, in 316, Constantine kicked off the rise of the authority of the church, in particular Christian bishops. He declared that bishops could now preside and have official power over the freeing of slaves. Now, this wasn't a banning of the institute of slavery itself, and certainly the bishops didn't call for an end to slavery altogether either. But if an individual did want to free a slave, or a slave had managed to buy himself his freedom, then the bishops did now have the power to preside over the proceedings and authorise the action of manumission, something that only the secular courts previously had. In 318 CE, Constantine further increased the powers of Christian bishops. He allowed bishops to preside over other cases as well that previously only a secular court could judge. In effect, Christian bishops also became judges now, and this meant Christians could bypass the secular courts completely for pretty much anything, and thereby lessening what had previously been the sole authority of the secular courts. And I'm guessing Christians who had cases against pagans could take their case to the bishop instead now, where they would presumably get a more sympathetic hearing from a fellow Christian. And 2 years later, there was further concessions for Christian clergy. He would exempt Christian clerics completely from tax and any other public service that everyone else was still expected to fulfill. And this exemption even included their wives, children, and servants. So even servants serving bishops and priests were considerably more well off than their counterparts serving ordinary people. So this was a massive inducement to join the Christian clergy, particularly as the tax benefits extended to the whole family. No tax would have to be paid even on any businesses they owned. And laws like this obviously considerably reduced the amount of tax collected, however, as the church establishment grew over the years and the tax burden would naturally increase on the rest of the general public. In 321 CE, Constantine also allowed bishops to grant Roman citizenship to any slaves being freed by their master, and this was again something that was taken from the secular courts, thus weakening their position. And in the year 333, Constantine further increased the prestige of Christian bishops, giving them the same power as secular judges, In other words, they could make the same decisions that the judges could. And in fact, any person could request that their case be put forward in front of their own bishop rather than the secular judge. And of course, this undermined the judicial system even more and gave the church pretty much unlimited power over not just church matters, but secular matters as well. So, with the church now exempt from tax and with judicial powers being handed over to Christian bishops, the independence of the church was already beginning to take shape. The second big issue was the matter of inheritance laws. In 321, Constantine changed the laws on inheritance, allowing people to leave property, wealth and land to the church. And this fairly innocuous ruling probably didn't have much of an effect during his time, but over the decades and centuries, this would have a massive impact. Over the next couple of hundred years and into the Middle Ages, it's estimated the Catholic Church would end up hoarding almost a third of the land as people hoping for a place in the Christian heaven left land freely to the church in their wills. Now, when this was combined with the rulings exempting the church from paying taxes on money earned from their landholdings and other assets, it signalled a huge loss of revenue to the imperial treasury at exactly the time when money was needed as the empire came under threat in the late 4th and 5th centuries from barbarian invasions. And this loss of revenue would affect other states that formed after the Roman Empire, right up to relatively recent times, with the Catholic Church and monasteries, etc., holding large estates of land and, of course, still being exempt from any sort of taxation. In the year 320, Constantine made a third major decision. He would lift the Roman laws discouraging celibacy and childlessness. Previously, men and women were encouraged to marry and reproduce. But the Christian Bible actively encouraged the opposite, i.e. celibacy. In the New Testament, for example, Jesus looks favourably on eunuchs. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, when he is discussing the issue of marriage, Jesus declares that those who abstain from marriage and sex in order to keep the eye on getting into the kingdom of heaven are the most admirable people. And Paul also held the same point of view, and which he articulates in 1 Corinthians. He suggests it's better to stay unmarried and that an unmarried man with his mind unobstructed by marriage and family concerns can better concentrate on pleasing the Almighty, although he concedes that if a man cannot control himself, as he puts it, then marriage is an option. And teachings like this encouraged the customs and traditions whereby monks, nuns, and Christian priests or anyone wishing to be seen as pious and religious were expected to be celibate and avoid marriage and sex. Now, this ruling would not have immediate repercussions, but as Edward Gibbons in his monumental work Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire points out, this policy would have a devastating impact as time went on. Women could now freely become nuns and lead a celibate life without children. As Christianity increased its hold, many women would become nuns and adopt the cloistered life. And in fact, there are reasons to think that some families would pressure their unmarried daughters or daughters who were getting a little older and push them into becoming nuns. And the impact was felt in the male population as well. The ruling meant that large numbers of men who were attracted to the church would become monks or join the clergy, not having any children at all. As other attractions and tax perks were being offered over the years, the temptation to join the Christian clergy or become a monk and live in a monastery increased. Christian priests and clergy did not have to join the army and were increasingly freed from taxation and other burdens that the common folk could not avoid. So there were good financial reasons for joining the church, albeit abandoning the option of having a life partner or family. But this policy of encouraging celibacy amongst both men and women would mean, as Gibbons pointed out, there was a significant decline in the birth rate in the Roman Empire over the next 150 years as the culture of monasteries and nunneries and the church establishment took hold. And it's estimated that the population of the empire fell by around 20% over time. Now, this wasn't all to do with Christianity, and certainly the unstable nature of the empire and economic decline may have had an impact, but it's undeniable the social and religious changes from A pagan culture which encouraged marriage and children to a heavily Christian-influenced lifestyle, and the introduction of celibacy as a positive and pious thing had a big impact over the years. The fourth change that would have a massive impact was initiated in the year 321. Constantine would signal the beginning of Sunday being a day of rest for everyone from now on. Not just Christians, but pagans as well, and Jews across the Roman Empire. And so this particular day begins to take on a special and traditional meaning in the Christian calendar. The only exemption was for farmers who, because of their trade, had to look after their crops, especially in the harvesting season, and of course the looking after of domesticated animals and so on. And this is interesting because the Jewish Sabbath allows for no exception for farmers. Perhaps Constantine realised the impracticalities of this decision, and that the day of rest could not be a universal law, as so much depended on farming in the Roman Empire. The only exception allowed later was legal transactions connected to freeing slaves. Now, these could still be done on a Sunday. Following on from making Sunday a special day, Constantine in the same year declared that all soldiers must gather together on that day, and that a prayer to God that he himself composed must be recited. Now, this doesn't specifically mention the Christian God, but it's certainly tilting towards making Sunday more religious than it was. According to Eusebius, this ruling was passed shortly after the declaration of Sunday to be a day of rest. Now, there were some miscellaneous acts passed by Constantine which are of interest, and one of his edicts reveals a certain superstitious element to his thinking. He certainly believed in magic and that it could be used for good or evil, and we know a law was passed whereby magicians were allowed to use their powers to increase the chance of a good harvest, but could not use their powers against fellow men in any sort of negative way to harm them. So, while this wasn't directly related to paganism, it shows us that Constantine and other Christians like him did believe that magic and sorcery were real. And, of course, this was very much consistent with the Bible, so it's not surprising in many ways. In the New Testament, in Galatians chapter 5, Paul lists sorcery amongst the works of the flesh alongside idolatry, and Revelation 21 lists sorcerers amongst those whose destiny is the lake of fire. So, as you can see, most of the implications of these edicts, as mentioned, are still with us today in some form or another. The power of the bishops and the church was gradually increased over the years till the church began to be almost a parallel institution to the secular Roman government, and in fact a very powerful institution, with the church not having to be subject to any tax on its wealth. Also, we can see with the promotion of Sunday as a day of special meaning, a format that we still use today. Let's turn to the vast bulk of the population, which was still pagan at the time of Constantine, and let's look at his attitude to the pagan traditions and customs and religion of his time. Unfortunately for the pagans, there was a little assistance in religious matters, and Constantine passed no laws and edicts to promote the traditional faith. In 323, Constantine began to show his anti-pagan agenda much more openly. He would prevent Christians from taking part in pagan festivals, or being forced to, shall we say, and this ruling came into effect on the 25th of December, which happens to be Christmas Day these days, but it used to be the exact day for the festival of Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, or birthday of the unconquered sun. The Roman festival of the Saturnalia ran from 17th of December to the 23rd of December as well. So, as you can see, the end of December was a very special time for the Romans. But Constantine, with this ruling, effectively discouraged Christians from taking part in any such pagan festivities that were so deeply embedded into Roman culture and the festival calendar. And in fact, anyone who tried to encourage a Christian to join in the Festival of the Sun or Saturnalia would either be beaten, or if he had a considerable rank, would be fined. Now, needless to say, eventually the 25th of December would be hijacked by the Christians and given over to the Festival of Christmas and recognised as the day of the birth of Jesus, even though the Gospels give no hint as to when Jesus was born. So the most important pagan time of the year was gradually transformed into the most important Christian festival of the year. Perhaps the only way that the Christian church could root out the Roman festivals, so deeply embedded in Roman culture and history, was by effectively taking them over. And in fact, as we know now, other pagan holy days and festivals were also taken over by the Christian church later on as well. The following year, after the war against Licinius in 324, and at a time when he now controlled the entire empire, Constantine passed his first clearly anti-pagan law. With no pagan emperor to champion the pagan cause, it seems Constantine had decided to be much more overt in suppressing pagan beliefs. Eusebius tells us that he declared pagan worship and the worship of statues or idols, and especially pagan sacrifices, to be illegal. Now, how true this is or how strongly this ruling was carried out, we're not sure, but as the first edict against paganism in an empire which was still largely pagan, it didn't seem to have too much effect. Another interesting ruling was the elimination of the gladiatorial games. Now, some attribute this to his Christian beliefs, but this was not necessarily so, as the culprits who would normally have been sent into the arena and made to fight each other or wild beasts would still not get off scot-free. Instead, they were to be used as slaves in the mines, which one could argue wasn't a whole lot better and potentially worse, as the conditions of working underground were obviously pretty terrible. And a year after that, in 326, which also happened to be the year after the Council of Nicaea, Constantine made one of his first moves against a prominent pagan temple. He would order the demolition of the Temple of Venus at Jerusalem and the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on top of it. The story is that his mother found the remnants of the true cross there, and the temple was therefore destroyed. The temple had been built by the Emperor Hadrian in the early 130s after the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt and the expulsion of the Jews from the city. And his confidence regarding destroying pagan temples perhaps got stronger at this time, for Eusebius tells us that in 330 Constantine also ordered the pagan temples and their altars and statues to be destroyed at the town of Mambre. Following the destruction, a basilica was ordered to be built over their remains, and of course the local government was told to assist with the building. Significantly, he again warns the local governors that if they ignore this command, there will be punitive action against them, which suggests that the area was heavily pagan and the governors may have balked at doing such a thing, and in fact they may have been pagan themselves. So, as you can see from the dates, Constantine treaded very carefully in his early years and passed no anti-pagan legislation. However, after his seizure of the East and when he became the sole emperor of the empire in 324, he did begin the destruction of various temples and signalled the beginning of the laws and edicts aimed at preventing paganism, which would continue after his death. Similar to the pagans, Constantine also passed edicts intended to suppress Judaism and the Jews. In 315, Constantine came out with his first overtly anti-Semitic policy. On the 15th of October, he ordered Christian converts from Judaism to be protected from any sort of punishment by Jews for leaving the faith. And any Jew who tried to prevent a conversion to Christianity was ordered to be burnt to death. And in fact, any Jew who left Christianity voluntarily, it seems, and converted back to Judaism would also be punished. Now, stoning to death for anyone apostatizing from Judaism is a commandment from the biblical God and very clearly specified in the Old Testament of the Bible. So you have this strange situation where Constantine is actually acting against the very holy book that he actually believes in and acting against a direct order of God which prevents people from leaving Judaism. And this is one of the many strange paradoxes which are created by Christianity departing from the rules and regulations of the Mosaic Law. Another ruling of Constantine was the prevention of Jews from questioning Jewish converts to Christianity. And this followed on from the earlier rulings that they weren't allowed to stone converts either. And this represents a further tightening of restrictions on Jews trying to reconvert Jews that had gone astray. In addition, Jews were not allowed to circumcise non-Jewish, i.e. Christian slaves, and if it was found that somebody had circumcised a Christian slave, then the slave would be set free. So as you can see, there is a gradual but pretty strong and noticeable trend during Constantine's reign. The laws being passed initially during his time as part of a tetrarchy or multiple rulers of the empire simply gave Christians the same rights, but over time the laws are getting ever more pro-Christian and sympathetic to their cause, especially with the elevation of the Christian clergy to great power. And finally, at the end of his lifetime, or near the end, he's quite openly showing his contempt for paganism with the destruction of the Temple of Venus at Jerusalem and the temples at Mambre. So, an increasing slide into intolerance. After the death of Constantine, we move on to a period where the empire was split and governed between his three remaining sons, Constantius, Constans and Constantine, although Constantius would outlive the other two by some margin. All three sons who had been brought up very firmly in the Christian religion by Constantine would essentially follow the same path as their father, and that was to promote and increase the power of the church while doubling down on Jews and pagans. Constantius and his brother Constans would, in line with Constantine's policy, continue making joining the Christian clergy a much more lucrative profession financially. In 343 CE, not only would Christian priests and, in fact, their families not have to pay any taxes, but the joint emperors also reiterated that their servants would be exempt from any taxation also, and any business they started too would be exempt from taxation. And this policy gave a massive subsidy to the Christian clergy at the expense of others, and one must presume that there would have been a rush to join the clergy by many who were lukewarm in their religious beliefs, but now also wanted to take advantage of the considerable tax concessions on offer by Constantius. Certainly, taking the job as a servant of a Christian priest was now much more lucrative due to the tax incentives than working for somebody else. In 355, Constantius also announced that bishops would no longer have to appear before any secular court as well, further solidifying the position of the Christian clergy. And you could consider this the germination of an almost parallel system for the Christian clergy, whereby only the clergy could judge other clergy, not the civil authorities, for any crime. The following year, Constantius would expand the number of people involved in the church being exempt from taxation to the gravediggers as well. So this pretty much completed all the categories of people involved in the church being totally exempt from tax. And in the same year, Constantius declared clergy, along with their wives, children and servants, are forever exempt from paying taxes, even if they engage in any sort of business or trade. However, in 360, Constantius, shortly before his death, made it clear that only the Orthodox strand of Christianity, the official cult, was to receive tax exemption, not the hundreds of other strands of Christianity like the Arians or Docetists, etc. And this was presumably to firm up the position of the official church. Let's turn to his attitude towards the pagans now. In 341 CE, Constantius would double down on pagan practices, reconfirming the laws set out by Constantine just after he had achieved victory over Licinius and became sole ruler. And this labelled the Roman customs as, quote, superstitions, unquote, and stressed they were not to be carried out any longer. One of his more curious decrees came in 343 and was regarding prostitutes that had converted to Christianity. The ruling is a little unclear as it mentions buying prostitutes as slaves, but the meaning presumably means purchasing her sexual services rather than purchasing her outright. Anyway, the ruling declared only Christians were allowed to purchase their favours, not Jews or pagans. Now, how a prostitute could be considered Christian or even religious in any sense while selling her body openly seems not to have bothered Constantius. And secondly, how this ruling could be enforced is a little difficult to understand as well, as prostitutes were hardly likely to turn down customers on the basis of religion. Presumably those following the new law would have needed to ask their clientele their religious beliefs before taking their money. By the 340s, many of the pagan temples were being closed down as people were encouraged to convert, and Constantius in 346 passed a law that temple buildings outside the cities could be preserved and be used for other purposes. Presumably the temples inside cities could be annexed by the church and turned into churches. In fact, in the same year, on the matter of temples in cities, I'm guessing his second degree closing them was fairly definitive. There's a little bit of uncertainty as to when this decree was declared. Maybe it was in 346, but some people think it may have been a few years later in 354 or 356. Whatever the case, Constantius was pretty insistent that the temples be closed, and anyone trying to access a pagan temple would face capital punishment. Constantius also threatened the local governors, saying that if they didn't help carry out this decree, they would face punishment as well. And in 353, Constantius also banned any nighttime pagan sacrifices as well, which we're told had been allowed by the pagan Magnentius, an usurper who tried to gain the throne in that year. Presumably by this time, open daytime pagan sacrifices had already been banned. And shortly after this, Constantius gave one of his most direct decrees against pagan worship, declaring anyone guilty of idolatry or any sort of pagan sacrifice to be given capital punishment. And he also reiterated many of the existing laws regarding Christian clergy, further consolidating their special positions, so exemptions from tax were further stressed. And he also continued to take sideswipes at what he thought was magic by the pagans, passing 2 laws on banning soothsayers and wizards or those accused of practicing magic. On the issue of Jews, Constantius took a decidedly harder line than Constantine, his father, did. In 339 CE, an imperial ruling by Constantius and his brother Constans decreed that Jews could not hold non-Jews, meaning Christians, as slaves. And if any Jew was found to have any Christian slaves at all, then his slaves were to be set free. Particularly interesting was the additional ruling regarding circumcision of slaves by Jews. Now, this was a ruling that had again been given by the biblical God in Genesis chapter 17, and even though the Christians believed in the Jewish scriptures as the Old Testament, nevertheless the emphasis was now on curtailing the allowances that had been given to Jews by previous pagan emperors. In the same year, Constantius and Constans passed a curious law. Now, it may be some cases were brought to the ears of the emperor by the bishops or other clergy, or it may be that significant numbers of Christian women or Jewish converts were being drawn back to Judaism at this time. It's difficult to say. The ruling accused the Jews of leading Christian women away from Christianity, and Jews were henceforth forbidden from preaching Judaism to women, and the penalty for any proselytization towards Christian females was to be a death sentence. In the year 352, Constantius was even firmer on anyone who was joining Judaism from Christianity. Anyone converting to Judaism was to have their property confiscated. And this decree is interesting because it was a time when Julian had become Caesar and was working under Constantius, although he had no significant power of his own at this time. So those were the pertinent laws and decrees passed by Constantius and his brother Constans and Constantine. Constantius, the last surviving brother, would die in 362 CE, and after his death, Julian, or Julian the Apostate as he was called by Christians later, would become emperor. Julian would try and revive paganism, but he did not pass laws actively discouraging or banning Christianity, which by this time was firmly embedded in power and may even have been the majority religion in certain areas of the empire. However, his actions were much more subtle. According to Gregory Nazianzus, Julian issued a decree that the Christian church be referred to as, quote, the Galilean movement, unquote, rather than the Christian church. And that was to show that the religion originated in Judea and was not Roman or Greco-Roman in origin. And perhaps this was a subtle way of telling people that this was not a belief that they should subscribe to, being an alien religion. Julian was also famous for passing a law banning Christians from teaching the pagan classics. And his reason for that was that Christians had no belief at all in the Greco-Roman gods, which play such a large part in pagan classics. So how could they teach something that they did not believe in? And this again was a very subtle way of showing that Christians were alien to traditional Greco-Roman philosophy and culture. One of his other acts was to restore property to non-Arian churches and other cults and various sects of Christianity. The reason ostensibly was to be fair to all beliefs and cults, but historians translate this as a way to try and split the Christian church. Each Christian strand was at loggerheads with another, and so all this infighting helped the pagan cause. So by restoring property to the various cults that had lost their churches and monasteries, it simply encouraged more dissension amongst the Christians. In this letter, Julian reveals that he has restored property to the non-Arians who lost it under Constantius, and he's also upheld legislation that a Christian may not be forced to sacrifice, even if his public office requires it. He instructs Christians not to riot, and he also informs us that he had taken away the right of bishops to serve as secular judges. And that was all that Julian in his short life managed to do. As mentioned, it wasn't his way to try and suppress Christianity or try and force people to convert back. And with the death of Julian in 364, the Constantinian Dynasty came to an end. The next emperor was a soldier called Jovian, elected by the officers under Julian after his death. But Jovian didn't have much of a chance to make an impact, dying within the year himself. He was, however, a fanatical Christian, and the only interesting edict he passed regarding Christianity or regarding the promotion of Christianity before he died was to stress that for the rape of celibate women or nuns or women in the church in some capacity or another, the culprit would face capital punishment. So that brought about an end to an interesting period, which initially started off with Constantine simply promoting Christianity, but not attacking paganism, to a period under Constantius during his later life when he was actively and openly banning pagan practices. All this happened in a period spanning less than 60 years and showed the impact that a Christian ruling class could make in banning traditional Roman culture and religious traditions. Jovian's death meant the beginning of a new dynasty, with a soldier called Valentinian being chosen as the new emperor, who would rule along with his brother and his sons for a couple of decades before the Theodosian dynasty took over. And we'll be discussing these two dynasties and continuing the story of the forced religious transformation in the Roman Empire in part 2 of this video. So please do keep an eye out for that. And finally, I hope you found this video interesting, and I will see you in the next one.